The transport ship Meridian Dawn shuddered as it dropped out of hyperspace near the contested world of Kepler 402b. Chief Petty Officer Marcus Tank Rodriguez pressed his face against the small porthole, watching the planet grow larger. Red dust storms swirled across its surface like angry spirits. "Beautiful place for a vacation," muttered Corpsman Jake Williams, checking his medical kit for the third time. "Nothing but sand, rocks, and things that want to kill us." Tank grinned, his weathered face creasing around his eyes. 20 years as a Navy SEAL had taught him to find humor in the worst situations. "Could be worse, Doc. Could be raining." The other members of Alpha Squad chuckled nervously. They were good soldiers, but none of them had faced what waited on Kepler 442b. The Zephyrians had taken the planet 6 months ago, turning it into a fortress world. Their crystalline bodies could withstand temperatures that would cook a human alive, and their energy weapons could cut through steel like butter. Captain Sarah Chen's voice crackled over the intercom. "Attention all personnel. We are approaching the drop zone. Intelligence reports heavy Zephyrian presence in the target area. Your mission is to locate and extract Dr. Elena Vasquez and her research team from the underground facility at coordinates 34.7N, 118.W. Tank stood up and began checking his gear one final time. His rifle was loaded with armor-piercing rounds designed specifically for Zephyrian physiology. His tactical vest contained enough explosives to level a building. Most importantly, the small device clipped to his belt held the real reason for this mission. Dr. Vasquez had been working on something the brass called Project Prometheus. Tank didn't know the details, but he knew it was important enough to risk sending a SEAL team into what amounted to a suicide mission. The Zephyrians had conquered 12 human colonies in the past 2 years. Humanity was losing the war. 30 seconds to drop, announced the pilot. Tank looked around at his team. Williams was young but skilled, fresh out of combat medic training. Sergeant Lisa Park had been with Tank for 5 years and could shoot the wings off a fly at 300 meters. Petty Officer First Class David Boom Martinez lived up to his nickname with explosives. They were the best humanity had to offer. The ship lurched suddenly and red warning lights began flashing. "We're taking fire!" the pilot shouted. "Zephyrian interceptors coming in fast!" Through the porthole, Tank could see brilliant blue energy beams slicing through space toward their ship. The Meridian Dawn twisted and rolled, trying to avoid the deadly light, but it was a transport, not a fighter. "It wasn't built for combat. Hull breach in Section 7, someone screamed over the intercom. The ship shook violently, and Tank heard the distinctive whine of atmosphere escaping into space. Captain Chen's voice came through again, tight with stress. "We're going down. Repeat, we are going down. All hands prepare for emergency landing." Tank grabbed the nearest handhold as the ship began spinning out of control. The planet's surface rushed up to meet them, growing larger and more detailed with each passing second. He could make out jagged mountain ranges and deep canyons carved by ancient rivers. "This is going to hurt," Williams said, his face pale as he strapped himself in tighter. The ship hit the atmosphere with a thunderous roar. Tank felt his teeth rattle as they plowed through increasingly thick air. The hull began to glow cherry red from friction, and he wondered if they would burn up before they hit the ground. Then the ship struck something solid, and the world exploded into chaos. Tank was thrown against the bulkhead hard enough to crack his helmet. Emergency lighting flickered on and off as the ship skidded across the planet's surface, leaving a trail of wreckage behind it. When everything finally stopped moving, Tank found himself hanging upside down from his restraints. His ears were ringing and he could taste blood in his mouth. Sparks showered down from damaged electrical systems, and somewhere in the distance he could hear the crackle of flames. "Sound off!" Tank called out, his voice hoarse. "Who's still breathing?" "Williams here," came the medic's shaky voice. "Got a broken arm, but I'm mobile," Park reporting in, said the sniper. "Banged up but operational." There was a long pause before Martinez responded. "Boom's alive, but my left leg's pinned under something heavy. Might need some help here." Tank cut himself free from his restraints and dropped to what had been the ceiling. His body protested with a symphony of aches and pains, but nothing felt broken. He moved carefully through the twisted wreckage, stepping over fallen equipment and trying not to think about how many people hadn't survived the crash. He found Martinez trapped under a collapsed beam, his face twisted in pain. Together, he and Williams managed to lift the debris enough for the demolitions expert to crawl free. Martinez's leg was clearly broken, but he could still walk with support. "What's our situation?" Park asked, looking around the ruined transport bay. Tank activated his tactical scanner and watched the display populate with information. "We're about 40 kilometers from the target zone. The good news is we're alive. The bad news is we're 40 kilometers from the target zone. Our transport is scrap, and we're in the middle of enemy territory." Through a gaping hole in the hull, they could see the alien landscape of Kepler 442b. The sky was a sickly yellow-green color, and twin suns cast harsh shadows across the rocky terrain. In the distance, strange crystalline structures jutted up from the ground like frozen lightning. "Sir," Williams said quietly, "look at this." Tank followed the medic's gaze to where Captain Chen was slumped over the ship's communications console. She wasn't moving, and there was blood pooling beneath her chair. Tank checked for a pulse but found none. Their commanding officer was dead along with most of the ship's crew. "We're on our own," Tank said simply. "Mission parameters haven't changed. We find Dr. Vasquez and her team, secure Project Prometheus, and get home. Questions?" His team looked at him with the kind of trust that comes only from years of fighting together. They were hurt, outnumbered, and stranded on a hostile alien world, but they were still SEALs. They still had a job to do. "No questions, Chief," Park said, speaking for all of them. Tank nodded and began gathering supplies from the wreckage. Outside, something howled in the alien wind, and he caught a glimpse of blue light moving in the distance. The Zephyrians knew they were here. The hunt was about to begin. The first Zephyrian patrol found them 6 hours after the crash. Tank and his team had been moving carefully across the rocky terrain, using their tactical scanners to avoid the worst of the alien sensor networks, when Park spotted the glint of crystalline armor in the distance. "Contact," she whispered into her comm. "3 hostiles moving along the ridgeline about 800 meters northeast." Tank raised his binoculars and studied the enemy soldiers. The Zephyrians stood nearly 8 feet tall, their bodies made of living crystal that reflected light like prisms. They moved with fluid grace despite their size, each step perfectly coordinated. Energy rifles were integrated into their forearms, capable of firing concentrated beams that could melt through tank armor. "They're scanning for us," Williams observed, watching the aliens sweep the area with handheld devices. "Those things can detect human heat signatures from a kilometer away." Tank made a quick decision. "We go around. Wide circle, use the canyon system to mask our approach. These things are hunters, but they're not invincible." They spent the next 4 hours picking their way through a maze of red stone canyons, moving single file with Martinez leaning heavily on Williams for support. The broken leg was slowing them down, but Tank knew they couldn't leave anyone behind. SEALs didn't abandon their own. The landscape around them was harsh and unforgiving. Jagged rocks cut through their equipment, and the thin atmosphere made every breath a struggle. The twin suns beat down mercilessly, turning their tactical suits into ovens despite the built-in cooling systems. "Chief," Park called softly from the rear, "we've got company." Tank spun around to see a Zephyrian scout emerging from a side canyon behind them. The creature's crystalline body caught the sunlight and threw it back in rainbow patterns as it raised its weapon. There was no cover, nowhere to run. "Take it down," Tank shouted. Park's rifle cracked, sending an armor-piercing round into the alien's torso. The bullet struck the crystal surface and ricocheted harmlessly away, leaving only a small chip. The Zephyrian didn't even stagger. Blue energy lanced out from the creature's weapon, missing Williams by inches and leaving a molten crater in the canyon wall. The air filled with the smell of superheated rock and ozone. Tank rushed forward, knowing that conventional weapons were useless at this range. The Zephyrian turned toward him, its faceted eyes reflecting his image a dozen times over. Up close, Tank could see that the creature's body was beautiful in its alien perfection. Like a living sculpture carved from precious gems, it was also completely lethal. The alien brought its weapon to bear, but Tank was already inside its guard. He grabbed the creature's arm and twisted hard, using leverage and momentum to throw the 8-foot monster off balance. It stumbled but didn't fall, its crystal body far more durable than human flesh and bone. The Zephyrian backhanded Tank with its free arm, sending him flying into the canyon wall. Pain exploded through his chest as ribs cracked against the stone. The alien advanced on him, energy crackling around its weapon as it prepared to fire. Williams appeared from the side, his medical kit forgotten as he drove his combat knife into the joint where the creature's arm met its torso. The blade found a weak point between the crystal plates, and purple fluid began leaking out like alien blood. The Zephyrian spun toward this new threat, but Tank was already moving. He pulled a thermite grenade from his vest and shoved it against the creature's back, where its power source was located. The grenade adhered to the crystal surface with a magnetic clamp. "Fire in the hole!" Tank yelled, grabbing Williams and diving for cover behind a boulder. The explosion was brief but intense, white-hot flame consuming the alien's torso. When the smoke cleared, the Zephyrian was still standing, but its movements were sluggish and uncoordinated. Purple fluid leaked from multiple cracks in its crystalline shell. Park put 3 more rounds into the creature's damaged torso, and this time they penetrated. The Zephyrian collapsed, its body dimming as the internal light source failed. "First kill goes to Alpha Squad," Martinez said with grim satisfaction, despite the pain in his leg. Tank examined the alien corpse, noting how the crystal structure had fractured under the thermite assault. "Thermal weapons work," he said. "High heat can crack their shells, make them vulnerable to conventional rounds. Remember that." They stripped the dead alien of anything useful, including a strange device that seemed to be some kind of communicator. Tank clipped it to his belt next to the Project Prometheus tracker. "Every piece of intelligence might be important later. How far to the target?" Williams asked, checking Martinez's leg splint. Tank consulted his tactical display. 28 kilometers northwest. If we maintain current pace, we should reach the facility perimeter by dawn. Assuming we don't run into more patrols, Park added, scanning the canyon walls above them. They resumed their march through the alien landscape, moving more cautiously now that they knew the enemy was actively hunting them. The Zephyrian communicator on Tank's belt remained silent, but he knew it was only a matter of time before someone noticed the missing patrol. As the hours passed, the terrain began to change. The redstone canyons gave way to strange metallic formations that seemed to pulse with their own internal light. Tank's radiation detector began clicking softly, indicating elevated energy levels in the area. "We're getting close to something," Williams observed, studying his scanner readings. "High electromagnetic activity ahead." Through the gathering dusk, they could make out a complex of buildings constructed from the same crystalline material as Zephyrian armor. Towers reached toward the alien sky like frozen waterfalls, their surfaces constantly shifting between different shades of blue and purple. "Zephyrian command post," Tank said. "Dr. Vasquez and her team are being held somewhere in that complex, along with whatever they were working on." Martinez struggled to his feet, testing his weight on the improvised splint. "So how do we get in there? Front door doesn't seem like an option." Tank studied the alien fortress through his binoculars. Guard patrols moved in predictable patterns around the perimeter, and he could see energy barriers flickering between the towers. It was designed to keep humans out and prisoners in, but as Tank had learned in 20 years of special operations, every fortress had weaknesses. You just had to find them and exploit them ruthlessly. "We wait for full dark," he decided. "Then we go in quiet and fast. Get in, find our people, and get out before they know what hit them." "And if things go wrong?" Williams asked. Tank checked his remaining explosives and smiled grimly. "Then we make some noise and remind these crystal freaks why you don't mess with Earth's warriors." The Zephyrians had taken human prisoners and stolen human technology. They thought their superior physiology and energy weapons made them untouchable. They were about to learn how wrong they were. The Zephyrian fortress was even more imposing up close. Tank crouched behind a metallic outcropping just 50 meters from the outer perimeter, watching the guard patrols through his night vision scope. The crystalline structures seemed to glow from within, casting eerie shadows across the compound. "Guard rotation every 12 minutes, Park whispered through the comm. 2 sentries at the main gate, 3 roving patrols, and what looks like automated defense turrets on the towers." Tank nodded, memorizing the pattern. The Zephyrians were methodical in their security arrangements, which made them predictable. In his experience, predictable enemies were dead enemies. "Doc, how's our demo man holding up?" Tank asked quietly. Williams checked Martinez's vital signs with a handheld scanner. "Pulse is elevated, but he's functional. The pain meds are helping. Good enough." Tank turned to address his entire team. "We go in during the next rotation gap. Park takes overwatch position on that ridge to our north. Williams and Martinez head for the east entrance and plant charges on the power distribution node I spotted earlier." I'll infiltrate through the main complex and locate our targets. That's a lot of ground to cover alone, Chief, Williams protested. Tank's expression was grim, but determined. These things killed Captain Chen and half our crew. They're holding American citizens prisoner. Someone needs to pay for that, and it might as well be me. They moved into position as the next guard patrol passed their location. Tank waited until the crystalline soldiers were well clear before sprinting across the open ground toward the fortress wall. His boots barely made a sound on the metallic surface as he pressed himself against the barrier. The wall was smooth and seemingly impenetrable, but Tank had come prepared. He pulled out a small cutting torch designed for breaching enemy fortifications and began working on a section near ground level. The device used focused plasma to slice through most known materials. The torch bit into the crystalline wall with a soft hissing sound, leaving a glowing line in its wake. Tank worked quickly but carefully, conscious that any mistake could trigger the fortress's alarm systems. Sweat dripped down his face despite the cool night air. Behind him, he could hear the muffled sounds of his team moving into their assigned positions. Williams and Martinez were good soldiers, but they weren't SEALs. This kind of deep infiltration mission was beyond their normal training. The cutting torch finished its work, and Tank carefully removed a section of wall large enough for him to crawl through. On the other side was a corridor lit by the same internal glow that seemed to permeate all Zephyrian architecture. Strange symbols were etched into the walls at regular intervals. Tank activated his tactical scanner and began moving deeper into the complex. The device showed multiple heat signatures scattered throughout the building, some moving in patrol patterns and others stationary in what appeared to be holding areas. He found the first group of human prisoners in a large chamber 3 levels down. Dr. Elena Vasquez and her research team were being held in crystalline cages that hummed with energy. The scientist looked up as Tank approached, her eyes widening with recognition. "Navy SEAL," she whispered. "I thought they'd forgotten about us." "Not a chance, ma'am," Tank replied softly, examining the cage mechanism. "What's your status?" 6 researchers still alive. "They've been interrogating us about Project Prometheus for weeks." Dr. Vasquez looked exhausted but alert. "They know it's important, but they don't understand what it does." Tank found what looked like a control panel for the energy cages and began working on it with tools from his kit. "What exactly is Project Prometheus? And please tell me you have it with you." Dr. Vasquez smiled for the first time since he'd arrived. "It's a weapon system, Chief. One specifically designed to disrupt Zephyrian crystal matrices. The prototype data is stored in my neural implant." Tank paused in his work to stare at her. "You're telling me you have a Zephyrian killer weapon in your head?" "Essentially, yes. Project Prometheus generates a specific frequency of electromagnetic pulse that causes their crystalline bodies to resonate and shatter, like an opera singer breaking a wine glass, but much more violent." The cage mechanism finally responded to Tank's efforts, and the energy barrier flickered and died. Dr. Vasquez stepped out gratefully, followed by her 5 surviving team members. They were all scientists, not soldiers, but they looked determined to escape. "Can this weapon be mass-produced?" Tank asked as he led them toward the exit. "Given proper facilities and resources, yes. We could have battlefield-ready units in 6 months." Dr. Vasquez paused. "Assuming we survive the next 6 minutes." Alarms began blaring throughout the complex, and the corridor lights shifted from blue to harsh red. Tank's comm crackled with Williams' voice. "Chief, we've got problems. Martinez triggered something when he set the charges. They know we're here." Through the crystalline walls, Tank could see Zephyrian soldiers moving with purpose toward their location. The aliens had abandoned their normal patrol patterns and were now actively hunting the intruders. "Time to go loud," Tank muttered, switching his rifle to full automatic. "Doc, get these people to the extraction point. I'll buy you some time." "Negative, Chief. Martinez is down hard, and there's at least 20 hostiles between us and the exit. We need another way out." Tank thought fast while energy beams began lancing down the corridor behind them. The Zephyrians were closing in from multiple directions, and his small team was vastly outnumbered. "Change of plans," he announced. "We're going up instead of out. Dr. Vasquez, is there anything in this facility you need besides yourself and your team?" "The main research computer has backup files that might be useful," she replied. "But it's heavily guarded in the central tower." "Then that's where we're going." Tank pulled out his remaining thermite grenades. Sometimes the best way out of a trap is to spring it so hard it breaks. The first Zephyrian soldier rounded the corner at a dead run, its crystal body refracting the emergency lighting into rainbow patterns. Tank put 3 armor-piercing rounds into its torso before it could raise its weapon. The alien staggered but kept coming. Tank activated a thermite grenade and threw it at the creature's feet. The device stuck to the floor and exploded in a burst of white-hot flame. This time, the Zephyrian went down and stayed down. "Move!" Tank shouted, leading the group of scientists toward a maintenance shaft he'd spotted on his scanner. "Park, I need covering fire on the north approach." Park's rifle cracked from her overwatch position outside the fortress. Through the walls, Tank could see more Zephyrians falling as the sniper found her marks. But there were too many of them, and his team was running out of ammunition. They reached the maintenance shaft just as another patrol appeared at the far end of the corridor. Tank boosted Dr. Vasquez up into the opening, then helped her team members follow. Energy beams scorched the air around them as the aliens opened fire. "Williams, report!" Tank called out as he climbed into the shaft. "Martinez is stabilized but unconscious. We're pinned down in the power distribution chamber. I count at least 15 hostiles outside our position." Tank looked at the frightened scientists around him in the cramped maintenance shaft. These people held the key to winning the war against the Zephyrians, but they wouldn't survive another 5 minutes unless someone did something drastic. 20 years of special operations had taught Tank that sometimes a SEAL had to make the hard choices. Sometimes one man had to stand against impossible odds so that others could live. He pulled out his last thermite grenade and smiled grimly in the darkness. Time to show these crystal freaks what a human could do when backed into a corner. Tank dropped back down from the maintenance shaft into the corridor, leaving the scientists hidden above. Energy beams immediately lit up the space around him as 6 Zephyrian soldiers advanced from both directions. Their crystalline faces showed no emotion, but Tank could sense their confidence. 6 against 1 were good odds in anyone's book. They had no idea what they were dealing with. Tank dove behind a decorative pillar as concentrated energy fire turned the air, where he'd been standing into superheated plasma. The crystal structure of the pillar began to glow and crack under the assault. But it held long enough for Tank to plan his next move. He activated his last thermite grenade and rolled it down the corridor toward the largest group of aliens. The device's magnetic clamps secured it to the floor, and Tank counted down the seconds while energy beams continued to slice through the air above his head. The explosion lit up the corridor like a miniature sun, and the screams of crystalline aliens filled the air. When Tank looked around the pillar, 3 of the Zephyrians were down, their bodies cracked and leaking purple fluid across the floor. The remaining 3 had taken cover behind their own structural elements, but Tank could see them moving to flank his position. He keyed his comm as he reloaded his rifle. "Williams, I need you to create a distraction, something big enough to draw attention away from the scientists." "Roger that, Chief. Martinez left me a present before he passed out. 1 proximity mine attached to the main power coupling. When this goes off, it should take out half their electrical grid. Do it." The explosion rocked the entire fortress, and every light in Tank's section flickered and died. Emergency illumination kicked in a moment later, but the damage was done. Somewhere in the darkness, he could hear Zephyrian voices raised in alarm. Tank used the confusion to advance on the remaining aliens. His night vision gave him an advantage in the reduced lighting, and he moved through the shadows like a predator stalking prey. The first Zephyrian never saw him coming. Tank appeared behind the creature and drove his combat knife between the crystal plates at its neck. Purple fluid sprayed across the wall as the alien collapsed. The second one turned toward the sound but couldn't locate Tank in the darkness. An armor-piercing round took it in the head, shattering its crystalline skull like glass. The third alien was smarter. It activated some kind of internal light source and began methodically sweeping the corridor. Tank found himself caught in the open with nowhere to hide. Energy fire scorched past his head as he dove for cover behind the corpse of one of the other aliens. The dead Zephyrian's crystal body provided temporary protection, but Tank knew it wouldn't last long under sustained fire. He pulled out his sidearm and waited for the alien to advance. When it came around the corner, Tank was ready. 3 quick shots to the creature's torso, followed by his last thermite charge pressed against its back. The alien reached behind itself to remove the device, but Tank was already rolling away. The thermite burned through the Zephyrian's power source, and it collapsed in a shower of crystal fragments. Tank climbed back up to the maintenance shaft where the scientists were waiting. Dr. Vasquez looked at him with something approaching awe. How many of them were there? she asked. 6. Tank helped her down from the shaft. Come on, we need to reach that computer you mentioned before more patrols show up. They made their way through the darkened fortress, stepping over the bodies of fallen aliens and avoiding the sparking remains of damaged equipment. The power outage had disabled many of the fortress's automated defenses, but Tank knew it was only a temporary advantage. The central tower was 5 levels up from their current position. Tank led the group through a maze of corridors and stairwells, constantly checking his tactical scanner for hostile movement. Twice they had to hide while Zephyrian repair teams passed by, working to restore power to critical systems. There, Dr. Vasquez whispered as they reached the tower's main computer chamber. That's what we need. The room was filled with crystalline data storage devices that pulsed with internal light. Streams of information flowed between the units like liquid fire, creating patterns that were beautiful and alien. Dr. Vasquez approached the central console and began working with practiced efficiency. I need 5 minutes to download the backup files and upload a virus that will corrupt their copies of our research. Tank posted himself at the entrance while the other scientists kept watch at the windows. Through the transparent walls, he could see Zephyrian patrols moving throughout the complex below. They were searching systematically, closing off escape routes one by one. Williams, what's your status? Tank called softly through his comm. Still pinned down, but Martinez is conscious again. He's rigged another surprise for our crystal friends if they try to rush our position. Stand by for extraction. We'll be coming down fast. Dr. Vasquez looked up from the console with satisfaction. Done. I've got the backup files and their computer system will start eating itself in about 10 minutes. Tank nodded and began leading the group back toward the stairwell. They had made it 3 levels down when the fortress's main power came back online. Lights blazed to life throughout the complex, and Tank heard the distinctive hum of energy weapons charging up. Contact! One of the scientists shouted from the rear. Multiple hostiles approaching from below. Through the stairwell windows, Tank could see at least 20 Zephyrian soldiers ascending toward their position. The aliens moved with deadly purpose, their weapons already trained upward. Tank made a command decision that would have gotten him court-martialed under normal circumstances. He pulled out his sidearm and shot out every light fixture on their current level, plunging the area into darkness. Follow my voice and stay low, he told the scientists. We're going up instead of down. They climbed rapidly through the darkened stairwell, guided only by Tank's night vision and the sound of alien pursuers behind them. Energy beams lanced upward, leaving molten scars in the crystalline walls. At the top level of the tower, Tank found what he was looking for. A large window that overlooked the main courtyard, where Park had established her overwatch position. Park, I need precision fire on the tower's base. Target the main support struts. Chief, that'll bring the whole structure down. You're in there! Tank looked at the terrified scientists around him, then at the tactical display showing dozens of Zephyrian soldiers converging on their location. Sometimes a SEAL had to make the impossible choice, negative. We're going to ride it down. Light it up, Park. Park's rifle cracked repeatedly from her distant position. High explosive rounds struck the tower's crystalline supports with devastating effect. Cracks spread through the structure like lightning, and Tank felt the entire building begin to sway. Hold on to something, he shouted to the scientists. This is going to hurt. The tower collapsed in a cascade of crystal and metal, carrying Tank and his charges toward the fortress courtyard below. Through the chaos, Tank could see Zephyrian soldiers scattering to avoid the falling debris. As the structure fell, Tank made eye contact with Dr. Vasquez and smiled grimly. Welcome to Earth Special Forces, ma'am. We tend to make an impression. The tower hit the ground with a sound like 1,000 windows breaking at once. Tank felt the impact travel through every bone in his body as he rolled with the motion, trying to protect Dr. Vasquez from the worst of the debris. Crystalline fragments rained down around them, some pieces as large as boulders. When the dust settled, Tank found himself buried under a pile of crystal rubble in what had been the fortress courtyard. His tactical display was cracked but still functional, showing multiple fractures in his ribs and a concussion that made his vision blur at the edges. Sound off, he croaked into his comm. Anyone still breathing? Dr. Vasquez emerged from under a fallen beam, her lab coat torn and blood running from a cut on her forehead. 4 scientists accounted for, she reported. Lost Dr. Peterson in the collapse. Tank felt a familiar stab of guilt at losing someone under his command, but he pushed it aside. Grief was a luxury he couldn't afford right now. Around the wreckage, he could hear Zephyrian voices shouting orders in their crystalline language. Williams, status report. Martinez is hurt bad, Chief. Internal bleeding. Possible punctured lung. I've got him stabilized, but he needs real medical attention soon. Tank struggled to his feet, using a twisted piece of tower framework as support. Through the settling dust, he could see Zephyrian soldiers emerging from the fortress buildings. They moved cautiously, unsure whether the humans were alive or dead. Park, can you give me an estimate on hostile forces? Counting at least 30 active combatants, Chief. They're forming up for a sweep of the crash site. You've got maybe 2 minutes before they reach your position. Tank looked around at the scientists huddled in the wreckage. These people carried humanity's best hope of winning the war, but they were researchers, not warriors. They couldn't fight their way out of a paper bag, much less a Zephyrian fortress. But Tank was a Navy SEAL, and SEALs didn't surrender. He pulled out his rifle and checked the ammunition counter. 17 rounds left, against 30 aliens armed with energy weapons. In normal circumstances, those would be terrible odds. Tank had never been interested in normal circumstances. Dr. Vasquez, he said quietly, do you still have that Project Prometheus data? She tapped her temple where the neural implant was located. Safe and sound. But it won't do us any good without a way to implement it. Tank smiled grimly and reached for the captured Zephyrian communicator on his belt. During the fighting, he'd noticed that the device seemed to be connected to the fortress's main systems. If he was right about its function, it might be possible to access the complex's defensive networks. What kind of power source would the Prometheus weapon need? He asked while examining the alien device. Significant electrical output, something like a starship reactor or a major power plant. Dr. Vasquez paused as understanding dawned in her eyes. You're thinking about using the fortress's own power grid. Tank nodded as he worked to interface his tactical computer with the Zephyrian communicator. Williams, I need you to get Martinez and yourself to the main power distribution chamber. Can you do that? Negative, Chief. Too many hostiles between here and there. We'd never make it. Tank had expected that answer. He looked at the advancing Zephyrian soldiers, now less than 100 meters away and closing fast. In 60 seconds, they would be close enough to see movement in the wreckage. In 90 seconds, the fight would be over, unless Tank did something to change the odds. He activated the captured communicator and was rewarded with a stream of crystalline text scrolling across its display. Most of it was incomprehensible, but Tank's tactical computer began translating the simpler commands automatically. I'm going to create a distraction, he told his team. When I give the signal, everyone moves toward the east wall. Williams, you carry Martinez. Park, provide covering fire from your current position. Chief, Williams protested. What kind of distraction are you talking about? Tank found what he was looking for in the communicator's menu system. The fortress's automated defense turrets could be controlled remotely, and the Zephyrians had been careless about their security protocols. They hadn't expected a human to capture one of their command devices, the kind that makes them wish they'd stayed home. Tank replied as he began reprogramming the fortress's defensive systems. The turrets mounted on the remaining towers suddenly swiveled away from their normal outward-facing positions and began targeting the Zephyrian soldiers in the courtyard. Blue energy beams lanced downward, striking the aliens with devastating precision. The Zephyrians scattered in confusion as their own weapons turned against them. Crystalline bodies shattered under the concentrated fire, and purple fluid pooled across the ground. The survivors took cover behind whatever structures they could find. Move now, Tank shouted, leading the scientists toward the fortress wall while the aliens were distracted. They ran through the chaos of friendly fire, staying low to avoid the sweeping energy beams. Tank counted the turrets as they fired, trying to calculate how long his hack would last before the Zephyrians regained control. 20 seconds. Maybe 30 if they were lucky. Dr. Vasquez stumbled over a piece of debris and Tank caught her before she fell. Stay with me, Doc. We're almost there. Behind them, he could hear Zephyrian voices raised in anger as they worked to shut down the corrupted defense systems. Tank's sabotage wouldn't last much longer, but it had bought them precious time. They reached the east wall just as Williams and Martinez emerged from the fortress. The demolitions expert was unconscious, his face pale from blood loss, but he was alive. Williams had rigged a makeshift stretcher from debris and was pulling him along. We need an exit strategy, Tank called into his comm. Working on it. Chief, I can see vehicle movement about 2 kilometers north. Looks like our crystal friends called for reinforcements. Tank studied the wall in front of them. It was too high to climb and he was out of cutting tools, but Martinez's demolitions kit was still attached to the unconscious soldier's belt. Tank grabbed a thermal charge and placed it against the base of the wall. Everyone get back. This is going to be loud. The explosion blew a hole large enough for them to escape through. As they stumbled out into the alien wilderness beyond the fortress, Tank could see lights in the distance. Zephyrian aircraft were approaching fast, their energy weapons already charging. We need transport, Dr. Vasquez said, stating the obvious. Tank looked back at the burning fortress, then at the approaching aircraft, then at his injured and exhausted team. They were outgunned, outnumbered, and trapped on a hostile world with no way home. In other words, it was Tuesday for a Navy SEAL. I've got an idea, Tank said, pulling out the Zephyrian communicator again. But you're not going to like it. Sometimes the best way to steal a spaceship was to make the enemy think you were already dead. Tank led his group away from the fortress ruins, moving through the rocky terrain toward the approaching Zephyrian aircraft. Behind them, the crystalline complex burned with internal light as damaged systems overloaded and exploded. Smoke rose into the alien sky like a funeral pyre. Chief, this is insane, Williams whispered as they took cover behind a metallic outcropping. You want us to get closer to those things? Tank studied the approaching aircraft through his binoculars. 3 Zephyrian transport ships, each capable of carrying a dozen soldiers. They were moving in a standard search pattern, spreading out to cover maximum ground area. Look at their formation, Tank said, handing the binoculars to Dr. Vasquez. They're coming in for a rescue operation, not an attack. They think their people might still be alive in that fortress. Dr. Vasquez watched the ships for a moment, then understanding dawned in her eyes. You want to hijack one of their transports? Exactly. But first, we need to convince them we're dead. Tank activated the captured communicator and began working through its menu systems. This thing is connected to their command network. If I can send the right signals, I might be able to fool them into thinking the fortress was completely destroyed. The lead transport was now less than a kilometer away, its blue-white engines casting eerie light across the landscape. Tank could see weapon ports opening along its hull as the pilot prepared for potential combat. He found what he was looking for in the communicator's emergency protocols, a distress signal indicating total facility destruction with no survivors. Tank modified the message to suggest that the human prisoners had died in the collapse, then transmitted it to the approaching ships. The effect was immediate. The transport's weapon ports closed, and its flight pattern changed from aggressive to cautious. The pilot was now treating this as a recovery mission rather than a combat operation. Williams, how much explosive do we have left in Martinez's kit? Tank asked. Williams checked the unconscious soldier's equipment. 2 thermal charges and a proximity mine. Not much firepower. It'll have to do. Tank studied the terrain ahead, planning his approach route. When that transport lands, they'll send out a search team to look for survivors. I'm going to take them out and steal their ship. That's suicide, Chief, Park's voice crackled through the comm. Those things are 8 feet tall and made of living crystal. You can't fight them hand to hand. Tank smiled grimly as he checked his rifle one final time. Watch me. The lead transport settled onto a flat area about 300 meters away, its landing gear extending with mechanical precision. A ramp lowered from the rear of the ship, and Tank counted 6 Zephyrian soldiers emerging to investigate the fortress ruins. Tank moved through the shadows like a predator, using every bit of cover the rocky terrain provided. 20 years of special operations had taught him how to become invisible when necessary. The aliens spread out in a search pattern, their crystalline bodies reflecting the ship's running lights. Tank reached the transport's landing site while the crew was still examining the fortress. The ship's ramp was guarded by a single pilot, its attention focused on the radio chatter from the search team. Tank approached from the pilot's blind spot, moving carefully across the metallic ground. One sound would alert the creature to his presence. One mistake would get everyone killed. He was 3 meters away when the pilot began to turn. Tank lunged forward, driving his combat knife between the crystal plates at the creature's neck. Purple fluid sprayed across the transport's hull as the alien collapsed without a sound. Tank dragged the body inside the ship and began examining the controls. The Zephyrian interface was completely alien, but his tactical computer started translating the basic symbols automatically. Engine controls, weapon systems, communications array, tank to team, he whispered into his comm. I'm aboard the transport. Start moving toward my position, but stay hidden until I deal with the search team. Through the ship's windows, Tank could see the 6 Zephyrian soldiers returning from the fortress ruins. They moved with military precision, but their body language suggested they hadn't found what they were looking for. Tank activated one of Martinez's thermal charges and placed it near the ship's fuel storage compartment. If things went wrong, he would at least deny the enemy their transport. The first alien reached the ship's ramp and called out in its crystalline language. When the pilot didn't respond, it began climbing aboard to investigate. Tank was waiting for it. The creature entered the transport and immediately spotted the dead pilot. It raised its weapon, but Tank was already moving. He tackled the 8-foot alien, using momentum and leverage to drive it into the bulkhead. The Zephyrian was stronger than Tank, but it couldn't bring its energy weapon to bear in the confined space. They struggled for control, crystalline claws scraping against Tank's armor as the alien tried to break free. Tank managed to grab one of the creature's arms and twist hard, feeling crystal crack under the pressure. Purple fluid leaked from the damaged joint, and the alien's movements became sluggish. A thermal charge pressed against the creature's back finished the fight. Tank rolled away from the explosion, his ears ringing from the confined blast. When the smoke cleared, the Zephyrian was dead. 4 more aliens were now climbing the ramp, their weapons charged and ready. Tank grabbed the dead pilot's energy rifle and opened fire from behind the transport's cargo containers. Blue energy beams filled the air as both sides engaged in close quarters combat. Tank's cover began to melt under the sustained fire, but he managed to take down 2 more aliens before his position became untenable. He retreated deeper into the ship, drawing the remaining Zephyrians away from the ramp. In the engine compartment, Tank made his stand with his back against the power core housing. The 2 surviving aliens advanced cautiously, their weapons trained on Tank's position. They had him cornered with nowhere to run. In their crystalline minds, the fight was already over. Tank activated his last thermal charge and held it up where they could see it. "You know what this is?" he asked, knowing they couldn't understand his words but hoping his tone would convey the message. The aliens hesitated, recognizing the threat even if they couldn't comprehend his language. "That's right," Tank continued, his finger hovering over the detonation switch. "Mutually assured destruction. You shoot me, we all go up together." The standoff lasted 10 seconds before Tank made his move. He threw the thermal charge toward the ship's forward section and dove behind the power core as it exploded. The blast disabled the transport's main electrical systems and filled the compartment with smoke. In the confusion, Tank managed to close with the remaining aliens and finish them off with his combat knife. When the smoke cleared, he was the only living thing aboard the ship. "Williams, bring everyone aboard," Tank called through his comm. "We've got transport." As his team climbed into the stolen ship, Tank examined the control systems more carefully. The tactical computer was making progress with the translation, identifying basic flight controls and navigation systems. Dr. Vasquez looked around at the alien technology with professional interest. "Can you fly this thing?" Tank strapped himself into the pilot's seat and began the startup sequence. "How hard can it be? It's got engines, controls, and wings. Basic aerodynamics are the same everywhere." The transport lifted off smoothly, rising into the alien night sky. Tank tested the controls carefully, getting a feel for the ship's responses. Behind them, the fortress continued to burn, sending smoke and flame high into the atmosphere. "Where to now, Chief?" Williams asked, checking on Martinez's condition. Tank studied the navigation display, looking for any indication of human presence in the system. According to his tactical computer, there was a small outpost on one of the system's outer planets, a research station that might still be under human control. "We go home," Tank said simply, "and we make sure this Project Prometheus data gets to people who can use it." Through the cockpit windows, the twin suns of Kepler 442b were beginning to rise, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was almost beautiful if you could ignore the fact that the planet was crawling with hostile aliens. Tank set course for the outer system and engaged the autopilot. They had a long journey ahead of them, but they were alive, free, and carrying the weapon that might turn the tide of the war. Not bad for a day's work. 6 months later, Tank stood on the observation deck of the Earth Defense Force battleship Retribution, watching the final assault on the Zephyrian home world. Hundreds of human ships filled the space around the crystal planet, their hulls bristling with the new Prometheus weapons that Dr. Vasquez had helped design. The war had turned dramatically after their escape from Kepler 442b. Within weeks of their return, human engineers were mass-producing resonance weapons that could shatter Zephyrian crystal matrices with precise electromagnetic pulses. The aliens' greatest strength had become their greatest weakness. "Chief Rodriguez, report to the bridge," came the announcement over the ship's intercom. Tank made his way through the familiar corridors of the human vessel, past crew members preparing for the final battle. Many of them looked young, barely out of training, but their eyes held the determination that Tank had come to expect from Earth's warriors. On the bridge, Admiral Sarah Chen turned to greet him. She was Captain Chen's older sister, promoted to fleet command after the loss of the Meridian Dawn. Tank had personally delivered the news of her sister's death, along with his after-action report. "Status update, Chief," Admiral Chen requested. Tank consulted his tactical display. "Prometheus weapons are fully charged and ready across all ships. Dr. Vasquez confirms that the resonance frequency has been calibrated for maximum effectiveness against Zephyrian architecture." Through the main view screen, Tank could see the alien homeworld spinning slowly below them. Its surface was covered with massive crystalline cities that reached toward space like frozen cathedrals. It was beautiful in its own alien way, but Tank felt no sympathy for its inhabitants. The Zephyrians had started this war by attacking human colonies. They had killed Captain Chen and countless other good people. Now it was time to finish what they had begun. "All ships, this is Admiral Chen," came the broadcast across the fleet channel. "Commence final assault. Target all major population centers and military installations. Show them what happens when you attack Earth." The space around Tank filled with brilliant light as hundreds of Prometheus weapons fired simultaneously. The electromagnetic pulses were invisible to the naked eye, but their effects on the planet below were immediately apparent. Across the Zephyrian homeworld, the great crystal cities began to resonate and crack. Towering spires that had stood for millennia crumbled into dust as their molecular structure collapsed. The aliens' technology, their architecture, their very bodies were all based on the same crystalline matrices that the humans had learned to disrupt. Tank watched the destruction with professional satisfaction. This was what happened when you underestimated human ingenuity and determination. The Zephyrians had thought their superior technology made them untouchable. They had learned too late that humans were very good at finding ways to kill things that wanted to kill them. "Incoming transmission from the planet's surface," the communications officer reported. "The Zephyrians are requesting terms for surrender." Admiral Chen looked at Tank, who shrugged slightly. The decision wasn't his to make, but his opinion was clear. You don't negotiate with people who tortured prisoners and tried to exterminate your species. "Tell them they have 1 hour to evacuate all remaining civilians to the outer moons," Admiral Chen replied. "After that, we glass the planet." Tank nodded approvingly. It was harsh, but fair. The Zephyrians would survive as a species, but their military capability would be completely destroyed. They would never again threaten human colonies. As the hours passed, Tank watched evacuation ships fleeing the dying planet below. The Prometheus weapons had done their work thoroughly, reducing the Zephyrian war machine to crystalline dust. Their fleet was shattered, their armies were dissolved, and their home world was uninhabitable. Dr. Vasquez joined Tank at the observation window, looking tired but satisfied. The past 6 months had been exhausting for her, working around the clock to weaponize her research. But the results spoke for themselves. "Any regrets, Doc?" Tank asked. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the last evacuation ships disappear into hyperspace. "They gave us no choice," she finally said. "Project Prometheus was always meant to be a defensive weapon. If they hadn't attacked our colonies, none of this would have been necessary." Tank understood her feelings. Taking a life was never easy, even when it was justified, but sometimes violence was the only language that aggressors understood. The Zephyrians had learned that lesson the hard way. "Chief Rodriguez," Admiral Chen called from across the bridge, "I have new orders for you." Tank approached the Admiral's station, wondering what came next. With the war effectively over, there would be rebuilding to do, colonies to re-establish, and new threats to prepare for. The galaxy was a dangerous place, and humanity would need its warriors more than ever. "You're being promoted to Master Chief and assigned to the new Special Operations Command," Admiral Chen announced. "Your first mission is to establish training protocols for deep space reconnaissance. Apparently, Command thinks your experience with impossible odds might be useful." Tank smiled and accepted the promotion orders. After 20 years of service, he was still learning new ways to serve his species and protect human interests. The Zephyrian War was over, but there would always be new challenges ahead. "One question, Admiral," Tank said. "What about my team?" "Williams has been accepted for advanced medical training. He'll be working with Dr. Vasquez on developing new battlefield medicine techniques. Martinez is recovering well and has requested transfer to demolitions instruction. And Park." Admiral Chen paused with a slight smile. "Park has been assigned as your second-in-command at Spec Ops." Tank nodded with satisfaction. Good people deserved good opportunities, and his team had earned their rewards. They had faced impossible odds together and emerged victorious. In Tank's experience, that was the kind of bond that lasted a lifetime. As the fleet began its journey back to Earth, Tank took one last look at the ruined Zephyrian homeworld. The crystal cities were gone, reduced to glittering dust that would drift in the solar wind for generations. It was a monument to the consequences of underestimating human determination. The Zephyrians had pounded the Navy SEAL until he almost fell. Then he rose, and they never did again. Tank had kept his promise to Captain Chen and his fallen crew members. The mission was complete, the enemy was defeated, and humanity was safe. For a warrior, there was no greater victory than that. In the distance, Earth's sun was growing brighter, calling its children home. Tank settled in for the long journey, already planning the training programs that would prepare the next generation of human warriors for whatever threats might emerge from the darkness between the stars. The war was over, but the mission to protect humanity would never end. And Master Chief Marcus Rodriguez would be ready for whatever came next.